Hey, welcome to the Coffee with the Doctors, the podcast. I am your host, Dr. Chris.
And I'm Dr. Liesel.
Hey, and we shine a light on the powerful scholarship emerging from Michigan's practitioner scholars working in K-12 schools. Each episode, we sit down with educators, leaders, researchers whose work is shaping classrooms, guiding policy, and transforming communities.
So grab your coffee, settle in, and join us as we elevate the voices, ideas, and innovations driving Michigan's educational future. Hey, so Dr. Chris, what is on the agenda for this week?
All right, Dr. Carlson, listen, um, we've been going all around the state of Michigan, and this week we'll be heading to a rather dreary place, a place of momentary joy, but everlasting sadness and sorrow. A region of the state that, despite their challenges, though, they're somehow seeming to slowly push through all the pain and sorrow that exists there. And I have to say that this sorrow, this pain exists perpetually, academically and athletically. This is the more inferior university and city. It is U of M in Ann Arbor. But yet, there resides one shining star. And I'm not talking about Yaxel Lindbergh. I'm talking about Dr. Tom Drake. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much. I work with many shining stars, and it is actually shocking, I think, how many people are on faculty that are U of M grads. I can think of like are MSU grads. I have like at least four or five people that I see regularly at faculty meetings that are all MSU grads from different eras. So,
I do have to say that last weekend at the U of M College of Ed graduation, I saw many and some who are current and former faculty at MSU. And during the Hail to the Victors, they were minorly participating.
What?
They were like,
Okay.
Dr. Ann Austin got a little grief from the dean.
I
that's
love it.
funny.
Yes.
Also, congratulations on being, the parent of a newly minted teacher.
I know. It's so
Yes,
exciting. So
it's
exciting.
amazing stuff.
All right. Well, hey, we are so fortunate to have our friend, colleague, Dr. Tom on, and he has been a teacher and a leader in Detroit and New York City, Massachusetts. You've made your rounds. Also a leader in those areas. He's current faculty at U of M, so the Barb from Dr. Chris. So we are excited to get into really talking about what your dissertation was, and then really the so what now, the work you do in instructional design, and fortunate that, yeah, my daughter got to be a student of yours. So very
Awesome.
exciting. So
Well,
Chris, cue us up.
all right, here we go. So, Dr. Drake, we usually like to start our pod with this question. When it comes to coffee, do you like Folgers or fair trade?
I will go with fair trade 98% of the time. The
Okay,
only thing Folgers is really good for is they have half calf,
that's right. That's right.
which, um, will prevent you from getting too wired.
That's right. I should have suspected such an answer from
Yes.
an arborite.
Yes.
But we ask this question because it usually cues up what we get to talk about, and that is our dissertation process. For us as EDD students, we did our dissertations of practice at Michigan State back in the day, and so coffee was the fuel to help us wake up at 4, 5 a.m. and just type research right, erase, type research right until we were done. And just getting in those rhythms helped to establish um, getting up early and just talking about big ideas. And that was the impetus for this podcast. And so now we love to use this as a segue to learn about people's dissertation processes and what they wrote on. For you, though, you are a PhD student. There
Yeah.
will be no Jill Biden discourse here. We love our EDDs. But if you could maybe, for the listeners wondering what the differences are, maybe talk about what your PhD process was like. And then if you could, maybe talk a little bit about what you actually sought to research and address in your dissertation.
Absolutely. So, oh, the process was really long. Process was really long. And for anybody listening to this, especially if you're like a working scholar, like, if you're a grown adult who's pursuing, advanced degrees, with a family, with a house, with a job, like I was so amazed at myself. I got to candidacy, essentially or I finished all my coursework in a year and a half, right? I moved very quickly. It
Yeah.
took me a year to write my proposal because, like, I've done a lot of different kinds of work within education. So figuring out exactly what I wanted to do was a little bit of a struggle. And then, I mean, there was a pandemic. There was a pandemic at the time.
Yeah.
I had two children under 10. But it was a 5 year process getting from that approval to getting things done. And some of that was, my own learning. Some of that was, just the wheels coming off and trying to figure out how to get them back together. But thankfully, I had a great committee, including my chair, Madeline Mavrogidato, um, who's still faculty at MSU and is wonderful. And anybody interested in work on English learners and other broader work on policy and learning-centered leadership, definitely someone to look into. Um, as well as other members of my committee, Beth Ann Smith, Christy Cooper Stein, Tara Chambers, and John. Oh my God, why can't I think of John's last name
You have
right
John
now?
Yoon?
Yeah, John. Yu. Thank you. We're all, wonderful and helpful in getting this to its completion. I think, one of the things that is uh, different for me as someone coming into like a PhD program later, and I started when I was like 35 or 36, um, it's heavily shaped like my scholarly process, the kinds of questions and projects I get involved in has been remarkably heavily shaped by like my experiences in practice.
Mhm.
Um, and this is very true with my dissertation. So the core concept of my dissertation was to think about how individuals who are in leadership positions within schools, so school principals, how their influence or how they perceive their own influence in relation to racialized identities,
Mm.
and then how the staff and the teachers within the building in kind of interpret their quality of leadership, like their abilities and their willingness to work with them, like how much they value their leadership is also shaped by racialized identities of both the principals and the teachers. And so this was really directly impacted by my practice experiences. So I spent a solid over, but in a straight line, slightly over 10 years in K-12 education. I was a teacher in Southwest Detroit, South Bronx, and the New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is it's a still a gateway city for many folks from different places who are coming in, most typically from former Portuguese colonies, right? So, it was a remarkably, remarkably diverse and wonderful community that I got to work with there. But in each of these spaces, the two, I think, largest influences in my approaches to leadership were women of color. And within those spaces, both in the South Bronx and then in New Bedford, you know, I worked with a lot of white teachers. And, it's just as an observer, right? You see how people might, how they might respond to the ways leadership is presented. And there's certainly some like intersectional aspects of this, especially like with male teachers. But there was definitely large pieces of it that were attached to racialized identities, right? And so, um, the biggest piece of this, which is literally like we ended up having someone suspended because they had a blog post that was anonymous, but was, using very racialized, language in the blog post about the principal being demeaning, not only to her practice and her leadership, but, in ways that was about her physical appearance, right? And all of these elements, and that went beyond implicit bias, right? But in all the ways that these elements of implicit bias that or ways that which white supremacy ideology, like how whiteness is embedded within structures
Hmm.
and the way people think about those, um, it creates, some element of, not element of, but like people's perceptions of legitimacy and leadership, right? And so trying to think about what would be a structural role of power, right? Like hierarchically, we think about the principalship as like a position of leadership, but yet because of these, other elements of social capital that for some people is attached to, race, like they were resistant to that leadership, especially if that leadership was going against status quo, right? In terms of how they were supporting students in the building, how they were thinking about, how we make change. But also like if it didn't fit what they knew, right, as leadership, and they were, less ready to process that information, right, or value it. Um, and so from that, I went looking for a data set. I knew being a working practitioner, that a qualitative dissertation was going to be much harder for me to do that kind of interview work and kind of the in-depth, analysis. I think it probably would have been even given the nature of all the things involved in getting, federal data. And it's much harder now at this point, or, you know, I think it is at least. It's been a struggle. Um, but so I use the National Teacher and Principal Survey data. So this
Hmm.
is a restricted data set. There's some publicly available now, which there wasn't when I did this. Um, but it's a restricted data set, so you have to go through the processes of getting it licensed. I had a small old janitor's closet that was my secure room in Ericsson, that I would go to and have to like keep a fan on because it's like four computers and it would just get hot. Um, and then look through all of the variables that are available in these surveys and think about, okay, how do I really get to what this phenomenon I'm seeing is, right?
Hmm.
This dehumanization process and this devaluing process. And how does that manifest within what's in these survey items? And so, I had kind of two perspectives. One was, um, through the perceptions of influence, like how much principals perceive their ability to influence, within their schools. Um, and to some degree, I talk about this as both like a structural factor, like, people are in school districts. Those school districts kind of set some elements of policy about how much a principal may or may not be able to do. but also as like an interpersonal or operational kind of form of influence, like in the school building, regardless of what those structures are, like how willing are the teachers, like how connected are they, how willing are they to, really support the efforts of the principal to, make effective changes in the school. And the second perspective was again this question of perceptions of leadership quality.
Mhm.
So there were four separate items on the survey that really spoke to how a teacher would interpret the quality of the leaders in their building. Um, both of these analyses were run using regression models. I have some more advanced things that I'm working on now that I'm trying to put it into press. But you know, in the original analysis, the only element from that really came up strongly as having a negative perception of influence, specifically for principals of color, Black principals in schools that were um, actually no, scratch that. That's part of what I'm doing now. I'm trying to go between papers. Some of the others didn't necessarily show up or weren't observable within those regression models. I have some updated elements that I'm putting in a paper now, where specifically for curriculum, that is observed, right? So Black principals perceive lower levels of have lowered perceptions of influence over issues regarding the curriculum than white principals do. And the one thing in the newer paper that's more striking is I've started to build an interaction model where we looked at like the population of the teachers in the building. And so and this follows some work from I think the 70s with Elizabeth Cantor thinking about like the processes of marginalization or minoritization. Um, like there seems to be a threshold somewhere between like 70 and 80% where like if a principal was in a school that had more than 80% white teachers in their building, they perceived less. But if you
Wow,
switch
repeat
that,
that. Repeat that real quick. Say it one
yeah.
more time, Dr. Trey.
And to note, like the comparison group here is buildings that are 100% white
Yeah,
with teachers, which is many of the schools. So,
yeah.
and some of this data is at this point, a little bit old, but using that data set that I'm working with now, like 83% of teachers in schools were white. For principals of color, like all
Yeah.
principals of color, the median percentage of teachers in school was 83% were white. So I did a basic categorization where, we had like all the people in schools that were 100%, which was about 30 to 40% of the sample. And then it broke it down into categories. So then there was like a category of, I think 70 to 90 or 40 to 60, or it was quintiles. I think I did broke it down into so 20% down each, right? But that comparison group is, everybody from like 99.6% and up of their building was white teachers. And
Okay.
once you get into that range, that is, generally between like 60 to 70 or 81%, you actually see that most of the principals, Black principals specifically, in buildings that had a reduction of about 20% from that maximum, actually had much higher levels of higher perceptions of influence over the faculty, right? Like if there was enough of a critical mass
Mhm.
um, within the community.
Hmm.
Now there's no, this is not causal in any way. This is all associative
Yeah.
kinds of
Yeah.
work, but
Yeah.
it's thinking about how are these communities structured and how does that influence what's actually able to be done or not be done, right? Um, in the dissertation work, the other end of that was again perceptions of leadership quality, and that was of the dissertation, that was the one piece that had real findings. And it was there's lots of ways you can run these different kinds of quantitative models. How I
Mm.
set this up was a little bit more simply.
Yeah.
And so I set it up as like three subsamples. And so when I was looking at Black principles, I was only looking at Black principles. I wasn't also comparing Black principles to white principles. So I had
Yeah.
three separate models.
Yeah.
And really, part of the theory I was trying to work with is trying to understand like in these spaces for these individual principles, how is their leadership perceived? And again, all associative, but what I found was that for Black principles and Latinx principles, there was a significant negative impression of their leadership
Mm.
from white teachers as compared to other teachers in the building.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
right, and the thing that's interesting about that is like, they're talking about the same principle, right? So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's like the perception is off, and what was even to me, and I need to follow up on some of this, more interesting is right, like, and there's differences in the populations, but the numerically, like, it was a gradient.
Mhm.
Um, like for Latinx principles, right? It was not as negative as it was for Black principles, right? So it
Yeah.
felt like, the presence of anti-Blackness within those results felt very present.
Wow. Well, Tom, thank you so much for like unpacking the clip on your dissertation work. I mean, listen, I'm sure all five listeners are just they're just like, wow, how do I sign up for a PhD now? I will say, I'm so glad that you unpacked some of the nuances. We've had a number of different scholars on our pod um, just talk about racial mismatch and of staff to students, and oftentimes the recommendation sections for their work in the analysis section are farly different. With the analysis pieces being super robust, and then those recommendation sections being this tiny. As you think about that work, because we're coming out of a pandemic where the governor literally is saying we need more. Well, she probably didn't say, but some press releases said we need to diversify our teaching staff. Um, but as your work alludes to, there are trade-offs. And just because we get more diverse candidates in the tank does not mean we can actually do the thing that we want to do. But I'm wondering for you, being both a scholar and coming from the classroom, where do we actualize this work? How can we think about doing something? What are the first steps? Are these, is it HR departments? Can we begin to think about how we do HR departments? Do we need to just rethink Brown v. Board? And where do we start? And listen, before you do a disclaimer, the research disclaimer, which is it's a mindset. I want brass tacks. Give me something actionable today, Tom. Today that I can take to my school tomorrow.
Um, so I mean, I think, the answer, and while I'm thinking about leadership and staff mismatch, and you're talking to other people with mismatch on teachers and students, I think the answer is honestly the same. Like we need to disrupt white supremacists, and I mean I'm talking about race here, but right, like also patriarchal and also, cis and hetero, um, elements of supremacy within, our schools and classrooms. And I think about a lot of these things, like I think about a lot of my research, like from the perspective of a learning scientist.
Hmm.
Like so when I say that, like there is the optimal like dimension of we need to, elevate everyone's understanding and nature of the world, and hope that they become more fulfilled human beings and understand how these things live within themselves. And that's the optimal, but I also think like we can even break it down to, for people who are unlikely to reach that optimal outcome from like more of a Skinnerian perspective, like we need to make sure that these behaviors are not manifested in the classrooms because as much as I want to support the optimal development of teachers, the number one priority is the development of the children within those buildings, right? And
Mm,
how do we disrupt that? Yeah, and I don't have necessarily a complete answer to how we disrupt that.
yeah,
But, some of that comes in training.
yeah,
Some of
for
that
sure.
comes in dialogical work, and
Mm,
in having conversations, building community, building connectedness. Um, but it's not easy. And
yeah,
every time you think you're chipping away at it, like, the white supremacy adapts and finds a
that's
new
right.
way to try and
That's
come
right.
in, right?
That's right.
In those perspectives. So,
So and I totally agree with you. Like we kind of like to frame that as like there's the big E equity work and there's the
Hmm.
the little E equity work. And I think
Yeah.
about
yeah.
that. That to me connects to some of the work that maybe you're doing today. And I wonder around like as you're talking about what happens in the classroom, I'm thinking about how your work in instructional design can influence that classroom level work that we know data nationally around like didactic instruction in communities of color, right? Like that we see a
Hmm.
greater incidence of didactic instruction. How do those kind of think about like power structures and ability
Yeah,
to like have different types of instructional strategies, practices, and interactions kind of relate to some of the work that we're talking about.
that's good. That's good.
Yeah. Um, I'm not completely sure. I think there are some centerpieces that I go back to that sound kind of generalist when you look at them, but like thinking back to things like zone of proximal development,
Hmm.
like in both conversations, right? So in support of the classroom, like how do I understand where this human being is? What are the tools and resources I have available to support their development towards the goals, in part the goals I aspire to support them towards, but also the task that I've been, given by the school or district that I'm in. And then how do I help them achieve that? And, I take that same process up a level when I'm thinking about leadership, right? And kind of these concepts and how do we support teachers around these? And especially given the nature of teaching as a profession and the abundance of whiteness within teaching, right?
Hmm.
How do I think about how all of those factors play in, right?
Yeah, that's
You know,
good.
we've
That's good.
had other guests talk about some of their student voice research, some of their kind of design thinking process. And I think about, how perhaps like I think about your work and how you might see designing those instructional opportunities for, say, teacher candidates, right?
Hmm.
And then how they can, when we're aligned in the way we teach, like the how and the what, and how we influence then future teachers. I think some of the work that you've done, and how do you see that as being key to, a part of this work?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that in terms of teacher candidates, that's really essential, right? And so I don't actually teach a lot directly in teacher ed currently,
Hmm.
in my role. But I have actually had an uptick in the number of, pre candidates that are coming into my classrooms. And I think, for a lot of kids, a lot of young kids who are coming in wanting to pursue teaching, right? Like no one goes into being a teacher
Yeah,
because they want to make someone's life worse, right? Like
yeah,
because they want to
absolutely.
espouse things that are harmful. This is not, the motivator.
Yeah,
But they also are coming in with, a lot of blind spots, right?
yeah.
And just how a lot of these things are embedded and just, how they norm what they see as success,
Hmm.
or what they see as, optimal behavior, all of these kinds of things. There's the set of norming that goes around, all of the variant identities that you may encounter in a classroom and how, how do you support those kids, right? How do
Yeah,
you keep them safe,
yeah.
really support their development? There is one a newer project I'm on. It's actually my wife's project. That I think, I don't know that it's getting to solve the problem we're discussing today, but I think it's a wonderful curriculum. It's called Sparks. Um, and it's a speaking out and acting up against racism and xenophobia.
Mm,
And really, when we look at these curriculums, it's, a lot of it is awareness development, and then it's how do we transfer from that awareness development to, you know, uh, meaningful, relevant, possible actions within the environments they're working in.
mm.
So.
Well, I guess if I could ask a follow-up, I think this is kind of speaks to the moment that we find ourselves in. Um, just frankly speaking, there's a term that you're using relatively often now, and that's white supremacy. We kind of exist in a space, and I'll say in K-12 spaces, where just even the use of that language um, begins to kind of undo implementation. Um, it's almost been demonized as much as the actual act of white supremacy. And so
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Tom, I mean, and this kind of goes along with, my wife had a conversation. Maybe I shouldn't even say my wife. But my wife was actually she was teaching her class about um, kind of early colonization, and she's a first grade teacher, and she was just talking about the nuts and bolts of colonization. From there, the kids said, um, "That's bad." She was saying, "Oh, slavery," or she wasn't saying. The kids were saying slavery. That's bad. Um, and they said killing Native Americans, that's bad. Um, these were things that probably 5 years ago, I think we just as a country had all come to grips with again, and it was fine, it was objective. But within K-12 spaces, these are literally lightning rods. It's interesting. I'm wondering, as you kind of think about your influence on education spaces that you exist in, and maybe how you kind of relate your work to practitioners. How can you help us think about that? And how can we maybe communicate effectively the harms and the dangers of white supremacy in such a way that we don't fall prey to greater white supremacy for saying white supremacy?
So, yeah, I mean, it
It's a big
is,
question, Tom. I'm
no, no,
sorry. You got a
it's a
PhD
good
though.
question. It's the right question because anybody who is a practitioner who's listening to this, please know that you're listening to someone who probably, I'm very fortunate, right? Like I'm a lecturer at a university. At a university in a purple state where actually the government has put in a lot of protections, a reasonable amount of protections for people. It doesn't mean there still aren't, many different elements that need to be addressed, but that's very fortunate, right? Like I am not the faculty member in Texas who was put on a camera and, fired 2 days later because of the way their governance structure works. I'm in a unionized position as well, right? So I have, a contract agreement. In addition to that, like I have a very supportive chair, is a chair engages in a lot of very critical, oriented work. Um, so I feel I am less influenced, right? Like if I was going into a school to teach, I probably would not be using the words white supremacy as much, like in this conversation. Um, I think my recommendation, or like I don't know, recommendation is not the right word, right? The balance is what does it take to stay true to the work, even if you have to use an altered language around it? Um, and the thing I try to always, remind, especially, white colleagues around is like, okay, this is a time when you're feeling a threat for having to do those things, for having to talk about these things or hold those beliefs, right? But whatever threat you're under now, A is absolutely nothing in comparison to that, many faculty of color and teachers of color have experienced throughout all of this time and long before that. Um, and I think, there needs to be a point where you have to know where that line is for yourself, unlike where, what is the hill I'm going to, be fired on, so to speak, if something has to happen. Um, you know, where am I willing to break with compliancy because I know that this is the right thing and this is a space where I need to do something for the safety of a child, for the safety of the community, and wherever those lines are going to be set are be highly variable depending on the context that you're in. Um, and I definitely feel for all of those educators in states where there's been really aggressive policy making to delegitimize and dehumanize people on many different identity levels, right? And for those listeners too, to know that these things are not grassroots organizations. Like you can go to that policy, and that policy is being written by organizations outside of the government, think tanks, and the language that's crafted in them is all the same, right? And all of these pushes, are really seeking to gain power by delegitimizing and dehumanizing others. So I would just encourage people to stay in the fight as much as they can. Be honest about themselves or be honest with themselves about where those lines are. And people have different lines for different reasons. Like, I'm also very fortunate that, if I were to get fired, we will be in a situation where my kids will not go without food. Like, maybe we have to sell our house, maybe we have to do something else. And I'm using this as an example, but there's no threat of that or negative things happening like in my current environment regarding that. But I've sat with teachers and librarians who've been fired, right, and are moving 6 states across country to find a new place to be, or people who there was a session a couple years ago who like did a display in their library, right, of different texts. And again, it's these are actors that are playing these roles. These in most cases, these are not like grassroots based approaches of families that are, seeking to empower this and embolden these ideas. Um, and the other thing I'll say is, there's a reason they're coming for it, right? And the reason is because ideas are dangerous, right? This kind of support and inclusion that all of us seek is in many ways a threat to kind of those structures, of white supremacy. So,
Oh, Liesel, you're on mute.
So appreciate kind of you digging into these really, yeah, currently and challenging and things that, our colleagues are experiencing. And I think we're all having to really consider those pieces. I think about also, there's when I think about kind of a message of next steps and hope, like, so really thinking about like some positive pieces around what would schools and classrooms look like if we could get beyond these things, right? So like we've talked about what are the recommendations, what are the next steps, but like we have to have a vision of what that might look like.
mhm.
And so thinking about like what would schools look like as environments, as places of democracy, if truly we could take, these recommendations.
Well, I'm taking a lottery ticket here. I'm going to say that there's infinite money that's funding what I'm going to describe to you, right? So I mean, we're seeing places that where students are deeply engaged in authentic learning processes, right? Where they're active in their learning. We're seeing spaces that are inclusive around, identity and ability, right? Again, like it's, sometimes I feel like I'm being lazy because I'm just going to go, oh, let's talk about Vygotsky again and zone of proximal development, right? But this frames my thinking so much, and it's so flexible because like I can use that as a element to rely on when I'm talking about, anything from supporting teachers to, trying to help my 14-year-old understand that they need to do the dishes, right? Like, like
Where's the
everything,
next work here?
yeah, yeah. Like anything you're applying it to in life, you can leverage that. But yeah, inclusive and supportive and identity affirming kind of spaces. Um, I think you are seeing accurate teachings of the history of the world and Dr. Chris, to your example earlier, like that teacher in that classroom, like you would get fired of him as a math teacher if you're teaching people that 2 + 2 = 5, right? And so when we try to teach these inaccurate histories
That's
of
right.
of
That's right.
what exists in colonialism and
Come
and
on.
slavery, it is, it's just so abhorrent, right? Like, and the thing is, I think that also makes it harder with an education, I think, because, we are, most of the people who go into education are people who are just really looking to be supportive of the development of others. We're not people who are going to look to get into political fights, right?
That's right.
So sometimes I think it's harder for us to stand up,
Yeah. Yeah.
and be active. Unless we know we're defending kids directly, right?
That's right. That's right.
Um, so that's part of it. I mean, the other thing that I think is definitely a part of it, and like when I dream of a better world, is that school and that school system
Yeah.
is ideally situated to be, not just a place that develops students, but a place that develops communities,
Hmm.
right? And so
There we go.
Yep.
how do we think about this, right? Like how do we think about, and that means a lot of different things. And so, that can be in terms of economic development and making sure that, parents and families have, the ability to find economic resources and jobs and work to, support themselves. That means making sure that, families have access and children have access to nutrients, right? And food
Come
and
on.
different kinds of social care and support systems that, are too often siloed
Mhm.
within our government structures in ways that, become ineffective. Um, yeah, and can be actively politically engaged too without
That's
some of
right.
these other problems, without these threats, right? Threats to their ability to survive.
That's right. Look, Dr. Drake, the kids say you brought the Draco. I shouldn't make a reference about violence on this pod. I do teach with young kids and they say wild stuff like that sometimes, so I need to make my brain appropriate. Um, I will say this for, again, now the seven listeners that have tuned into the pod. Um, Go back and listen to Dr. Drake's breakdown of his dissertation. I'm gonna re-listen to that part of the pod. That is so interesting. It lets me know that you gotta read a whole lot to be ready for this work. But since we are landing on the end of the pod, I have the big question for you. What are you currently reading? And if your dissertation is that complex, you cannot give us a recommendation about Simon Sinek, Brene Brown, Malcolm Gladwell. You just can't.
No, no, I'm
Martha
not.
Stewart cookbook.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. And, if there are people out there listening, I am easily findable. I would be happy to have a conversation if any of this stuff interests you. Please feel free to reach out to me. So I have two recommendations for you. One, both I've read and constantly go back to. And so, one element of the dissertation I didn't get into as much is there's definitely a movement of researchers who are trying to think more critically about how we use statistics, specifically in relation to a race, right? And how we think about race. How do we talk about race in terms of these statistics and numbers? And there's really a foundational text that is, it's not super quantitatively heavy. Like anybody can pick it up and read it. So like if you're like, I'm scared of math or stats, it's not that book. But it's called Thicker Than Blood
Oh,
by Tukufu Zuberi. He's a professor at Penn. And this is a 25-year-old book, but it's still a seminal read in terms of, it's the foundation for most of what has come in the last 25 years about thinking critically and really unpacking like how the study of statistics is really tied in social sciences to, eugenics and racism.
Mhm.
Um, and then also, how do we think about it? How do we work to leverage the power of statistical sciences in ways that are different and not deficit oriented and can actually really make contributions to racial justice.
Yeah.
The other one, and this one, I honestly probably read this over and over again. I teach it. That's why I have so many post-its on it. But let me get it in front of my face. There we go. Viral Justice by Ruha Benjamin. Um, this is it's brilliant. It's one of the, it's so well composed. In my perception, it's like if you've ever read any Bell Hooks work, like it's similar in terms of the level of contribution. I mean, it has a different orientation as a sociologist. There's a lot more work that is like statistically oriented brought into it. But the basic frame of the book, the basic premise and argument is, we society, schools, organizations, right? It's all just made up by people. and we build those patterns as people. And how do we, knowing the patterns that are harmful that contribute to injustice and inequity, how do we break those, in the places we are? How do we make new patterns and learn to support each other? It's a beautiful text. I recommend everybody read it. I've had kids have their like parents read it, and they're like reading it with their parents while they're reading it in class for like book club. It's great text, and a great scholar who was at, I want to say Yale, but might be Princeton. I might be mistaken, but amazing book.
Wow. Yes, I have it on my shelf. I agree.
Yes.
And I'm quite certain my daughter introduced it to me.
Yes, from class. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. We were so grateful to have this time together today. I feel like we could talk all morning and dig even deeper into kind of your thinking experience and research, and we're excited to see what you're publishing next.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity, and also, it's just a joy to be with two people who I know are really dedicated, caring educators, right? Who are invested in this work, and always a joy to talk with like-minded folks. So thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again for joining us on Coffee with the Doctors, where practitioner scholars help us rethink what education can be. We'll see you next time for another conversation at the intersection of research, leadership, and practice.